Valley's People, episode 23, Replayers Advised.
Welcome to the Valley's People. Thanks for joining us today, because today we're going to meet a man who's to take the musical heritage of those in the Hunter Valley through into the 80s. And we're also going to meet someone who at a very age of 22 years can claim to be a world champion. Hope you can stay with us. Our first guest today is someone who has the responsibility of coordinating and leading those who take music seriously well into the life of the community. And through the Conservatorium of Music in Newcastle, Mr. Michael Dudman, the principal, is with us to discuss those aspects of our cultural heritage, I guess we might say, of the Hunter Valley, because it does go back a long while, doesn't it, music? I mean, you could go back to the settlers, original settlers, I guess.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. Now, you are, shall we say, a principal who is also a musician. And I often wonder in those sort of senior appointments, like a plumber who has to take over a factory, how do you get on being a musician and also an administrator?
Well, I hope it'll be possible to remain a performer. To me, music's always been a very practical thing. It's something that you do, something in which you're involved, and I'd like very much to keep it that way. I don't want to be purely an administrator.
Well, that's good. I mean, for the sake of the talent to come, that's a good point of view, I guess. As an organist for the Christchurch Cathedral, which is really your background, isn't it? 12
Yes.
years as organist. And you've made 6 LPs. How would you rate the Christchurch Cathedral organ in Newcastle before we start talking about the Conservatorium?
It's a marvellous instrument. It's one of the best all-purpose instruments in the country. To be just a little technical, it's probably the finest romantic organ in the country, and certainly if one had to pick an instrument anywhere in Australia and say, oh, which one would I like to give a concert on, that would come very high on the list indeed.
Really? Well, you use the expression romantic organ. What does that mean in relationship to, say, the Sydney Town Hall or the Opera House?
The Opera House is a more classical organ, much more suitable for playing the music, say, of Bach and for music of the 18th century generally, but the Town Hall and the Cathedral organ here are more suitable for 19th century music and for modern music too.
Oh, really? The other thing that fascinated me about your background, Michael, was the term Master of Choristers, which you had at the Christchurch Cathedral, the boys' choir. And I've always wondered, I mean, I understand the musical notes, crotchets and quavers, but always wondered why boys made principal church choirs.
Sure. Well, as for the title Master of the Choristers, it's rather pompous, rather stuffy, you know, and it belongs to a different age. It's not one that of which I care to be reminded very often. The reason for using boys' voices is simply that the sound they produce after training is more suitable for that sort of music. It sounds better, and that's why we do it.
Yeah, I guess you've got 1,000 stories about boys' voices breaking at the wrong recital.
Sure, it's a sort of high risk situation, and you try and guard against the risks by feeding in at the lower end of the choir young children who will come through the ranks and compensate that way. But it's always possible to miscalculate because you can't tell when their voices are going to break.
The role as principal of the Conservatorium of Music now, I guess, as a layman, that each principal brings a certain philosophy with him. What do you want to see for music in the Hunter Valley?
Well, I'd like to see the Conservatorium continue or become even more part of the valley. I think the worst thing that a conservatorium or that any performing or educational institution can be is a sort of hothouse institution which is remote from the area in which it is. And so I would like the people in the valley and in Newcastle to look upon it as their conservatorium and as a place which will offer guidance and help and tuition and to establish incentives, musical incentives in the area.
Well, how do we do that, Michael? After all, it's a building that's got front doors and windows. I mean, how do you really get it out amongst the people?
I think we'll begin by encouraging the students and the staff to give concerts and recitals throughout the area and share music with the people in that way. After all, musical ability is a gift, and it's something which ought to be shared and not to be kept rather selfishly to oneself.
All right. So it becomes a, I hate to use the term, but a travelling conservatorium. People know what I mean. Your students will be seen.
Sure.
Yes.
I think that's necessary.
That's good. And what about the talent in the Hunter Valley? Obviously, we are supporting a conservatorium of music, but on any particular scale that you have in mind, I mean, how do we rate?
I think that the people of the Hunter Valley have great musical talent. It's always been an area that's produced fine musicians, orchestral players, pianists and singers, and many of these musicians are to be found in other parts of the country and overseas now, and there's every indication that that's going to continue.
And of course, you're looking forward, I guess, to a boom time because you've just acquired new premises. How will that affect the work?
It's a very exciting time. Through the generosity of the state government, we've acquired the old Salvation Army building, the former People's Palace building near the city square there. This is going to be renovated, and in due time we'll take up our residence there. Both the students and the staff are quite excited at the prospect, as you can imagine, so it all looks very rosy.
We've discussed about the conservatorium going out to meet the people, but I'm wondering if a moment you could take our viewers into the conservatorium, Michael. You know, what is inside a conservatorium, apart from a few little studios? How does the whole thing operate?
Sure. It provides a service at 2 or 3 different levels. First of all, there are the people we call single study students, people from Newcastle and from further afield who come and study perhaps singing or piano, organ, violin, and who have no further connection with the place after that. Then we have our full-time students, and they divide into 2 streams. The Diploma of Music Education students, who are later going on into secondary schools to teach music themselves,
right,
and people who have more of an interest in the actual business of performing and who'd attempt the Conservatorium Performers Diploma, which is a very high performing qualification. We deal with those people not only with the physical problems of playing an instrument or of singing, but we teach them all sorts of academic skills and backgrounds beside, in an attempt to make them all round well-equipped musicians.
I wouldn't want, well certainly not knowingly, want to destroy your status as principal amongst the other students, but I've got to register the fact that you are a family man with a young growing family. And I wonder then about your own musical interests, Michael. I mean, the pressures that are going to come on you, I guess, as you go, the family rises through teenagers, right through. Have you got a mind to represent all kinds of music?
I guess so. I think one of the nice things that's happened in people's view of music over the last generation, especially over the last 10 years, is that we no longer have the rather silly notion that there is good music and bad music, that there is classical music and pop music, and that there's a dividing line between them that can't be crossed. I can remember in its most extreme view, this even carried with it certain social attitudes, so that these sort of people liked classical music and those sort of people of whom one rather disapproved like popular music. All that is I hope, going now, and it's possible to see that they are just different aspects of the same sort of thing. I don't mean by that to say that there are no such things as good music and bad music, because technique in art is measurable, but it would be a very foolish view indeed, I think, to divide things into watertight compartments and to strike attitudes about them. And so if people can come to a love of music through, first of all, a love of commercial music, then why not?
Yes, I guess we've both seen people yawn at symphony concerts, haven't we? I mean, music has got to be something that hits you, the emotive side of the personality, isn't it?
Sure, and I think that music educators have themselves at least to blame to a certain extent for this boredom, because there's a great deal of rather pretentious nonsense spoken about serious music that at times seems to put it outside the understanding of people without perhaps a specialist background, and it shouldn't be like that. It should be something which is available to everybody.
Well, I gather from what you're saying today anyway, as principal of the Conservatorium of Music, that one, you want music to be taken to the people in the valley, and you plan to do so.
Indeed, yes.
Secondly, that your own philosophy of music is that there is good and bad in all forms, and therefore you have a fairly liberal attitude to the Conservatorium's approach to music.
I think we must do this. After all, the Conservatorium is located here to cater to the musical needs and developments of the region, and we must be very Catholic, I think, in our approach to the whole problem.
Right. Michael Dudman, thank you for appearing on today's program.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the Valley's people. Let's see our next guest in action. World surfboard champion from Newcastle, Mark Richards. Mark Richards became world surfboard champion in 1979 in a series of contests held in Australia, Japan, South Africa, Brazil, Florida, New Jersey and Hawaii. Mark Richards gained most points against over 500 competitors, and that's the first time by a Newcastle surfer. In fact, it's only the third time by an Australian. In 1976, Peter Townsend from Queensland, and Wayne Bartholomew in 1978. Welcome to the Valley's people, Mark Richards.
Thank you, Ron.
Mark, how do you become a world champion? Is it a simple matter of explaining the point system to us?
Well, it's not really easy to explain. There are a series of events throughout the world. They take in Australia, Japan, South Africa, mainland USA, and they finish up the year in Hawaii. And we have an international governing body which is called IPS, which is short for International Professional Surfing.
Right.
And they have a rating system by which they judge each event. The winner of an event receives 1,000 points. Second in the event receives 850 points. And then it drops by 15% all the way down to about 30th place till there's no points left. And the way the world champion is determined, it is not the person at the end of the year with the most points, although most of the time the guy with the most points at the end of the year is the champion, but they take the best 75% of performances. And that's how I managed to win in '79, because I skipped South Africa, Brazil, and the Californian contests, and only surfed in the Australian, the Japanese, and the Hawaiian.
I've heard of calculated risks, Mark, but that's a beauty, isn't it, where you can skip a couple and still come out on top?
Well, actually, I was very, very lucky to win. I had no desire to win the world title last year. After the Australian and the Japanese legs, I had a 1,000 point lead, and everyone was trying to convince me to follow the whole circuit and win the title, but I didn't feel like travelling, because to follow the circuit, you've got to spend the whole year travelling. And when I went to Hawaii for the last two events, I was 1,000 points behind the leader, who at that stage was Wayne Bartholomew. And virtually everyone thought I had no chance of winning, and I also thought I had no chance of winning. But as it turned out, in the Pipeline Masters, the first event over there, Rabbit bombed out in his first heat, receiving no points at all. Shane Horan, who was in second place, he bombed out too, receiving no points. And Dane Kealoha, who was in third place ahead of me, he made it to the final, and Dane came second in that event and I came fourth. But it still didn't change the ratings. I was still in fourth, and Wayne Rabbit Bartholomew was so far ahead, he was still in first position. And then it came down to the wire on the last Hawaiian event, which is called the World Cup, and everyone bombed out in succession on the way to the final. Like Rabbit was the first one to go, then Dane was the next one, then Shane, then I managed to make it to the final. It was amazing. I couldn't believe it.
The trouble with interviews, Mark, is that a little knowledge is dangerous. But I understand that you also, apart from the art and skills of riding, that you do have time limits put upon you out there waiting for a wave. Is that right?
Correct. Generally, yes. The time limit is 20 minutes for a preliminary heat and anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes for a final. And the thing is, the way events are run now, there's two people in the water. It's run similar to tennis on a 32-man format, man on man. They were run with 6 people in the water previously, which turned into a little bit of a zoo, because it was very hard to watch 6 people surfing. You might have a set of waves coming through and have all 6 people riding at once. But now what happens with only 2 people out there, there's an incredible amount of hassling, okay? And in 20 minutes, it's really important to catch 3 waves. It's judged on your 3 highest scoring waves. You can catch as many waves as you like, but they take your top 3 and total your points from that. And what happens is, It's not as though you both don't just sit out there and say, okay, I'll have this one and you have the next one.
Right.
Like the two surfers are hustling and jostling and like pushing each other, all trying to get the inside position closest to the breaking part of the wave, which is the position where the surfer has priority.
Yeah, so you've got to be a seaman too to pick the right wave. Have you ever picked a wave you wished you hadn't?
I've picked so many waves I wished I hadn't. It's very, very hard. Like you're sitting there and you know, the water can be like dead still, there'll be no sets coming through, and maybe the surfer you're competing against has had maybe 2 good waves and you haven't had any, because waves come in sets, okay, and you might catch a terrible wave and he might catch a good one, you paddle back out and sit there and no waves come through, and you'll see one come through that you'll think looks good, you know, peaks up well and has a nice long wall to it, and you take off and it completely closes out, and he'll take off on a wave that you think's a terrible one. You might let it go because you don't think it's any good, and it'll turn out to be the wave of the heat. So it is very hard to pick them.
So it's knowledge too. It's almost like the old fisherman's knowledge of watch every 7th wave. It's going to wash you ashore or over the rocks or something.
Virtually, like prior to surfing in an event, most of the surfers, I know I do, and I think the other surfers, they always sit down and you study the conditions. But the problem is that surf conditions change so much that you might sit there and watch the heat before you and say, okay, the waves are breaking right there, I'll sit there. And you'll paddle out in the next heat 20 minutes later and the tide may have come up or the tide's gone down and the waves have moved, say, 50 yards down the beach.
Yeah, so it's more frustrating than a lot of other sports, obviously.
It's very frustrating, actually.
Mark, the difference between the Newcastle surf that you're accustomed to and the Hawaiian surf, where you've done a lot of performance, most tourists who go through Hawaii and look at Malibu and so on just can't imagine that placid beach could ever get to 40 and 50 feet waves. Is it really like that?
It is terrifying over there. The surf only gets big in November, December, January and February, and in comparison to Newcastle surf, most of the surf around here is in the 4 to 5 foot category, sometimes smaller, and we surf on sand bottoms. Like you fall off a wave here, say the water's about 4 or 5 feet deep, and very rarely you hit the bottom, but if you do hit the bottom, you just bounce off sand and it doesn't hurt.
Yes.
Whereas in Hawaii, the surf can range from anywhere from 5 feet to 40 feet, and people do go surfing when the surf's 30 or 40 feet. And most of the waves break on very dangerous coral outcrops because they produce, like the hollow wave, that shallow coral bottom produces a good hollow, fast-breaking wave. And there's one place in Hawaii called Pipeline, which is probably the most dangerous wave in the world, and it's only about 4 feet deep, and the coral's not even, like there's jagged coral heads sticking up, and there's also caves in the coral. And what's happened is I've known a few surfers who have been driven to the bottom. See, when you fall off a wave, you hit the water and the wave explodes on top of you and it shoves you down and holds you down. Most of the times it just holds you flat on the bottom. When it releases, you swim to the surface. But at Pipeline, there's little tiny crevices and caves, and some people have been pushed down into these caves, and when the waves sort of let go, all the turbulence is gone, they've started to swim up and they've bounced, their heads hit a coral outcrop, and they've been stuck in a little cave, and they've had to sort of manoeuvre their way out of the cave and swim to the surface.
Does that explain why people have been killed in Hawaii, or well, injured anyway, if not killed?
Well, that's the main reason. Last year there was a surfer killed at Pipeline, and he was surfing out there on his own on a big day, and he was like impaled on the bottom, took off on a wave, like fell off, went in the water, and I think he hit a coral head with his head, was like died instantly.
But this must worry you, or don't you have any nerves?
Well, I worry about it a little bit, but I try not to take too many chances when I'm surfing that place. There's some of the safer beaches where the water's deeper, you take chances, but I'm actually completely paranoid of Pipeline. The only time I surf there is during a contest. And some people surf the place with no regard for their body. They'll take off on the biggest wave and, you know, just do the most radical manoeuvres, not worrying what happens to them. But whenever I surf it, I take it very easy because I don't want to become a statistic out there.
No, posthumous world champion is of no avail. The scene that I think most people who aren't into surfing see is that surfboard rider almost disappearing in the tube with a wave coming over the top of him. It must be a fascinating thrill to be in there.
It's definitely incredible. It's very hard to describe the feeling. Usually there aren't that many waves where you can get inside the tube. Like you need a good size swell running, and also you need a nice clean offshore wind to hold the face of the wave up. And the way you do it is, as the wave peaks and lifts up, you take off and you slowly drop down to the bottom of the wave and you hold your bottom turn and sort of you stall, like you lift the nose of the board, then let it fall down again. And while you've stalled at the bottom, the wave has tended to go past you and the lip of the wave throws out. And so when you get inside the tube, like you're leaning right into the wall of the wave, and you've got to lean and almost touch the wall of the wave, because the further you lean in, the less chance you get of being knocked off, because the curl's coming directly over your shoulder. So you've got to pull this shoulder in. And when you're inside, the wave twists and bends. Like you don't just go in a straight line and hold
so
your
it's
line.
not a tunnel, really?
It's not really a tunnel, it's like a bendy tunnel.
That's fascinating.
And as the lip's coming over, it's coming over in different spots. And all you can really see, it happens so quickly. It's reasonably quiet in there. I think your senses are really primed when you're in there and you don't really hear anything. But you can see this hole at the end, like everything's green and there's foam and it's all gurgling and everything. But there's this little tiny hole and you can see the wave forming off. Sometimes you can see the beach in the distance. And usually when they're really good, there'll be some surfer paddling out who's seen it and he's got his head like looking over the top of the wave. So you see this little hole with a head looking over at the end. It's really a lot of fun.
Yeah, it sounds as if it experienced almost like flying in the clouds. You know, it's a world of your own there.
I think it would be. Like I've never flown a plane, but I'd imagine it would be the same.
In an article recently in Surfing World, Mark, there are 2 points of interest that struck me. One, you said in this article that you felt that if you just maintained your surfboard riding in Newcastle, you'd stagnate.
Right.
And then in another paragraph you said that you really don't like contests all that much. Now, how do you relate one against the other? Because if you're going to leave Newcastle and not stagnate, I guess you've got to really start taking part in contests. Is that what you meant or not?
Virtually what I was saying was that I hate surfing in contests. I enjoy going to contests and I enjoy seeing surfers from different parts of the world and surfing with them, but I don't really enjoy the competitive thing because it's got really cutthroat these days with the introduction of larger prize money and the man-on-man format. It's got really personal the way the contests are being run.
You mean cutthroat as in tough?
As in tough, yeah.
Yes,
like
really.
It's very hard.
Elbows and boards.
And I'm reasonably mellow when I'm in the water. Like a lot of the other surfers can hassle and jostle a lot better than I can. But the comment on Newcastle was, on a performance level, there's a lot of excellent surfers in Newcastle, as good as anywhere else, but there's no one who can really push me on the level that I can surf at. The only times I can get pushed are when I go to a contest and you see surfers from Africa, Hawaii, America, and that was the reason why I said that. Like I like to be pushed by other surfers because in turn it sort of lifts my performance as well, because I'm trying to like surf as well as them too.
Yes, yes, I can understand that. You really need that sort of competition to lift a performance, don't you?
Well, you need it to lift a performance and also to keep improving.
Yes. Then I suppose you get those smart Alex who think they're as good as Mark Richards out at the beach too. And
not really. Everyone's pretty mellow around here. Actually, nobody takes any notice of me here.
Really?
Like they see me surfing every day. It's only when you maybe go to Sydney or go to Queensland that anyone really takes any notice.
oh, that's good.
It's quite good, really, because people still drop in and hassle me in the water.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Mark, in the reference to being cutthroat and sort of vying for position, almost like a yacht start, I guess, out there on the waves. I know there is a girls' competition for surfboard riding, but do you think they have the temperament to maybe to become world champion in open contest?
Well, there's been a few events where they've let the girls compete against the men. The first event where they did that was the Smirnoff in Hawaii, and that was about 3 or 4 years ago. And I think they invited the women's world champion at that time. And the surf was gigantic. It was about 15 to 20 feet, and she really didn't stand a chance at all. She was an excellent surfer, but she just couldn't keep up with the men in that like big strenuous surf. There's been a couple of events, the Bells event in Victoria and the Coca-Cola 2SM Surfabout in Sydney, where women have been invited to compete against the men. And there's one woman who's the world champion at the moment, Margot Oberg. She's from Hawaii, and she managed to progress through 2 rounds of competition, which was quite good. The main problem is that women aren't as strong as men, and you need a lot of strength to surf. Like it's hard to paddle out, and you need a lot of strength to catch waves. Yeah. And most of the conditions for events are very strenuous. And also, when the women get out there against the men, like the men are really bad hasslers, you know, like their positioning's a lot better than the women's. So you might have a girl who can surf as good as a guy, but she might not be able to position herself as well as the guy can. And it really boils down to the surfer that catches the best waves wins the heat.
Well, this has been a fascinating series of people in the Hunter Valley, Mark, and it's been my pleasure only twice at this program, only once before, to be able to talk to a world champion. Congratulations from the people in the Hunter Valley for that standing against so many nations. We wish you all the very best in surfing to come, and thanks for being with us today.
Okay, thanks, Ron.